999ers risk their lives every day keeping us safe.
We do this job to help people.
But all too often, they're abused and attacked.
The vehicle threw me like a rag doll. It should have killed me.
These personal attacks on police, paramedics and firefighters are at an all-time high.
I'll admit I was absolutely terrified.
We don't put on this uniform to be assaulted.
Leaving them traumatised and unable to work.
It felt like I was saying goodbye to my career.
But while the violent criminals responsible are hunted down and brought to justice,
You do not have to say anything.
our protectors fight to get well and back on the job.
I was not going to give up. There was no way.
It's took a hell of a lot of hard work to get back to the place I'm just now.
Ready to face the next critical incident. Today, a car chase with joyriders sees an officer thrown 100 feet in the air.
It should have killed me. The impact, the speed it hit me at, most people would have been killed by that.
A nasty racial attack leaves a paramedic unable to work.
I was in a dark hole and everywhere I was clutching, I was just falling back in.
And two police partners are proud to get back on the beat after an attack.
We're not going to let that incident or that person define us and kind of take over our lives.
PC's Laura Dew and Rich Chant have been partners for 5 years.
We've really got that father-daughter relationship at work.
They're part of the tight-knit team at Digbeth Police Station, where this morning Sergeant Corr is doling out the duties for the day ahead.
Chanty and Laura, you guys are on bikes today. As a sergeant, one of my top priorities is making sure my officers are safe.
But keeping her officers safe isn't always that easy. 3 months ago, Laura and Rich were patrolling the streets on their bikes when a call came over the radio that a fight had broken out.
We were round the corner from the actual incident. As soon as we got there, I could tell the actual person who was involved because of his demeanour, his body language.
The fighting has stopped when they arrive, but Laura senses a tense atmosphere and switches on her body cam.
As soon as I looked him square on, that's when I saw the anger in his eyes. As I have gone to approach him to try and talk to him, he grabbed me round by the throat. My colleague Richard came over straight away, tried to get him off me. Couldn't get him off me at first. He just wouldn't let go.
I went over and grabbed him by his throat and pushed him up against the window of the pub and squeezed as hard as I could on his throat to get him off Laura, because as far as where I was concerned, he was going to go down before she went down. He then released his right hand from Laura's neck and just square punched me in the nose, causing me to stumble back and then started to strangle her again.
That's when he strangled me for the second time, and I haven't been able to breathe that time. And I'd probably say in all the time of being a PCSO, a police officer, that's the worst feeling and experience that I've ever had to endure, really.
With his hands gripped around her throat, Laura fears for her life.
I pressed my emergency button. I didn't think I was even able to do that, but somehow I did. I managed to press my emergency button, which then obviously alerted other officers to come and help.
Back at base, Sergeant Corr can hear events unfolding on the radio.
I could hear Laura shouting on the radio. It's horrible because it wasn't a place I could run to and I didn't have any vehicles, so there was nothing I could do at that point in time. Our team's always out and about, so I knew there were officers who were making their way to both of them. But all I could do was sit and listen to the radio to make sure people were on their way.
PC Richard Blomer, another colleague, is on patrol nearby.
Initially, when the panic button come over, so I've heard it straight away in my earpiece, and all I can hear is PC Dew screaming, begging for help, and begging for him to get off her. All I was thinking was I need to get there, so I've just started running.
I was still then trying to process of how am I going to get him off her before he kills her. I knew at that stage that I got a broken nose, but I was happy to have a broken nose if it meant that he wasn't strangling her anymore. So I just punched him as hard as I could, I think for 10, 11 times in the head.
Come around the corner and all I can see is a mass of people around him. I can't see my colleagues at all, so I don't know what's happening, but all I can hear is screaming now. I can't hear it over the radio, I can hear it in person. I've got through the crowd and all I can see is Laura and Rich. The offender himself, he's got Laura around the throat and he's choking her. Rich, he had a broken nose, his nose is bleeding, there's blood pouring from his nose. He's trying to strike the offender in the face to try and get him off her.
Several other police have also arrived on the scene.
I've just ran in, grabbed him and thought I need to take him to the ground, I need to get him off her because I thought he's going to kill her. He's still fighting back, he's kicking back.
It takes several officers to finally wrestle the offender to the floor.
He had phenomenal strength, clearly, the way he was trying to get back up when he was on the floor, and it took about 6 of us to control him on the floor and get him cuffed.
Eventually, when his hands come from around my throat, I kind of feeling relieved, but trying to get my breath back at the same time. And I just remember just feeling a little bit limp and a little bit exhausted. Obviously, they managed to get him to the floor, and there was a bit of me where I think I just felt on him because I was trying to get my breath back.
Despite her injuries, Laura is determined to nick her attacker.
I actually arrested him myself. The minute I got my breath back and I was able to speak again, I just went straight into police mode.
You're under arrest for assault, you silly. You do not decide anything, remember? You do not mention what the questions that in which you to write in court. Anything you did, why are we giving it evidence?
All I did was I got up straight away, found PCG, checked she was okay, asked her a number of times how she was feeling. She was very vacant and just stared back at me. I then gone up to PC Chanty, checked how he was, but they both seemed in shock.
Got him in the police vehicle, and members of the public have actually started to clap. To hear that, it was actually quite a nice feeling. We all commented on it afterwards, and we all noticed it at the time.
While an ambulance arrives to take Laura and Rich to hospital, Richard heads back to base to file the case.
I just remember sitting there thinking, how do I describe how it seemed to me that he was trying to kill her, how he was trying to kill Laura. He clearly had his hands around her throat. And I think I sat there for about 45 minutes to an hour trying to get this statement down because I knew that that statement was going to be key evidence and hopefully bring this offender to justice. And it's hard, it really is hard.
Later, this violent offender gets his comeuppance.
I'm happy that he's behind bars and he's off the streets.
Police officers aren't the only ones to face attacks on a daily basis. 12 months ago, Suki Kaur was a paramedic in the West Midlands Ambulance Service. She was deeply passionate about her job, caring for the public and saving people's lives. But one night, a routine call to a patient turns nasty.
I was the paramedic, so I was the senior clinician that day. I asked the patient what the issue was in terms of his medical problem, and he stated he had abdominal pain. His father was present also. I wished to treat him with some intravenous paracetamol, because by giving him oral paracetamol it would have taken longer. So trying to do the best, as I always do, for the patients. At this point, he stated to me, "I don't wish for you to touch me." And I asked, like, what's the problem? He says, "It's the colour of your skin. Why don't you just go back to your own country?" He was fine with my Caucasian colleague. I'd stood up and the patient had cornered me into the ambulance. So therefore I wasn't able to go past him to get to the back exit door or the side entrance. So I tried to de-escalate with the patient and said, "Look, I need you to sit down." I felt really scared, I felt really isolated, really vulnerable, especially being cornered in, and at that point he'd made the declaration that it would be very easy to pull out a knife and stab me at that time. I was really feared for my life at this point. I'd never been in a situation like that, and I didn't feel that there was any way to escape. He was still continued to be abusive. At this point, his father started to contribute some verbal abuse also. I escaped whilst I could and ran into the cab at the front and locked myself in. And at that point, I had access to my radio, and I called the control room and stressed that I need the police immediately.
The police turn up, but Suki drives the patient to hospital.
I still continued to get dirty looks from the patient, snide remarks off the father, kind of turning their nose at me like I'm something on the bottom of their shoe. I've worked in the health and care sector for 14 years of my life, and I've never, ever endured an incident like that. Never.
Suki's attacker was charged with a public order offence with intent to cause fear and violence. The events of that day have had a devastating impact on Suki.
I was a nervous wreck. I was stressed, anxious, and I was putting on weight. I was comfort eating. I was really sad. I stopped exercising. The situation was becoming repetitive in my mind at night. I was not sleeping.
You wake up having nightmares. Sometimes might not just be exactly what happened on the ambulance. You know, I can sometimes keep dreaming of being entrapped and this fear of being enclosed and just not able to escape.
I was in a dark hole, and everywhere I was clutching, I was just falling back in.
When I feel anxious, or I feel that I'm having an anxiety attack coming on, I'm feeling panicked in any way. I've been doing these breathing techniques.
Suki also suffers physical signs of stress.
The alopecia was discovered by my mother 6 months after the incident at work had happened. When I went to my doctors, he had put it down to work-related stress. But, you know, I still have the flashbacks. Every time I see an ambulance or hear an ambulance, it brings back those awful memories.
And so, for the sake of her health, Suki decides to give up being a frontline paramedic.
You're leaving a job that once upon a time you loved, and now you almost resent it, despise it.
But she will never stop caring for people in need, and has instead found a new role as an emergency care practitioner.
So I will do home visits, I'll do out of hours, I do telephone triage, and I work in various doctors' surgeries.
She's proud of the job she does and of the years that she gave to the ambulance service. And to read through the many letters received from patients reminds her why.
I would like to say a big thank you and praise the paramedics that attended. They did a fantastic job and deserve to be recognised for their hard work and dedication to the service. All 3 paramedics were so caring and compassionate and looked after my mother so well. To thank the 2 ladies that attended him were excellent. First class. The staff were lovely, really reassuring. Could not sing their praises highly enough. Had a pacemaker fitted and doing very well. It was due to the crew that saved his life. He is very grateful. I wish you all success in your future careers in the health service. I've not forgotten them, and I can remember each one of the faces, each one of the way they were how scared they were, the questions that were asked, the reassurance that was needed. It makes me feel very proud and very humble as well.
Suki now wants to put the incident behind her.
I can't take the onus for someone's inappropriate behaviour, and I should still love the colour of my skin. I'm a woman of colour and I should be proud of that.
Back in Birmingham, after an unprovoked attack, PC's Laura Dew and Richard Chant are on their way to hospital.
We spoke to them on the radio to make sure everything was okay, and then I was made aware that it was probably a bit more serious than we thought it was originally when I was told they were on the way to hospital. So I gave them a call, spoke to them on the phone to make sure that they were okay. I think at that point, I don't know if it was possibly the adrenaline, but they kept saying, yeah, we are okay, but obviously we've got to get checked out at the hospital.
As soon as a nurse saw my nose, she said, you broke your nose, and I had a small hole in the left-hand side that was glued up.
He broke my right wrist, and then also my throat was quite inflamed. I couldn't eat, but I suppose it's not just the physical, it was the mental side of it as well, and what had happened. Something like that can really knock your confidence. Every time I finish work, I always sit in this particular spot. This is where I feel safe. If I need to cry, I cry, and this is the place where I'm just me. It's hard not to think about what you've been through. After what happened to me, this is where I came. I thought about it on my own, and sometimes even now, I could be watching TV, I could be doing anything, and all of a sudden it would just pop into my head what's happened.
Both officers are receiving support.
I think having the counselling really helped. That was really beneficial for both of us after we discussed it between ourselves. I'd felt that I'd let you down and I should have done more. And I felt guilty at the time for allowing him to grab her a second time and start strangling her a second time.
But I think, you know, you saying allowing, you did everything plus more, you know, what you could have done. I found it really hard. There'd be times when I'd be sitting at home and I'd just burst out crying for no reason. You know, I'd probably kind of cuddle my children that little bit tighter.
Laura's dad and sister are a huge support to her.
After it happened, I told you first, didn't I? Yeah.
You didn't tell me?
No. I try not to tell my family or go into detail what really happens on a daily basis. I think if I did, then my dad probably wouldn't let me go to work.
I'd have trouble stopping you, I think. You think what could have happened, and then after you think about it, you try not to think about it again. But it's inevitable that it's always there, I think, really. I was proud of her before, but quite honestly, that doesn't compare with what she's doing now.
I always find the job that we do, it is such a vicious cycle. So it's like we've just kind of got to keep going, really.
At times where I wish she wouldn't. But, you know, it's what she wants to do at the end of the day. It's what she's always wanted to do.
People don't see you as a human being when you've got that uniform on. I'm just a mum, I'm someone's daughter, and I'm someone's sister, and I'm someone's granddaughter. I'm just like everyone else.
But there is some comfort for Laura and Rich, and their attacker is made to pay. 4 weeks after the incident, the offender is in court. He pleads guilty to causing actual bodily harm and is sentenced to 2 years in prison.
You assault a member of the emergency services, then you need to go to prison for a long time.
I'm happy that he's behind bars and he's off the streets, so that's the main thing, really.
And while the offender is banged up, Rich and Laura are getting their lives back on track. 6 weeks later, they've both recovered from their injuries and they're able to get back in the saddle.
I was quite nervous to come back. It did knock my confidence a little bit, but it was like we hadn't been away.
It's good to come back, it's good to be back at work and get some structure back.
We predominantly work in the city centre, so we are here quite a lot. So any kind of feelings or nervousness that we had about coming back to the location, we've kind of had to put at the back of our head and just get on with it. And we've done that together, haven't we? We've just helped each other out.
Laura and Rich's colleagues are thrilled to have them back.
They're like family, so if it happened to one of your own members of family, I don't know how to explain how that kind of feels.
You know, it really does help when you've got a supportive team.
That kind of helps you get through it, knowing that you will keep going.
I still think now we've dealt with that incident, how we should have dealt with it. I'm really grateful.
Laura's like a daughter to me. You know, she really is.
I know I can speak for both of us. We're not going to let that incident or that person define us and kind of take over our lives.
Still to come, an officer nearly loses an eye in a routine bail check.
The next thing I felt was just excruciating pain. She was gouging my eye with her finger.
And after a joyrider ploughs into him at 50 miles an hour, a police officer defies all the odds to beat his injuries.
What happened that night should have killed me. It didn't, and I'm still here, and I'm still a serving police officer doing the job that I love to do. I have no reason to be angry or sad.
"999ers often run towards danger when most would run away. Like the police officers who chase down dangerous drivers and joyriders. In West Yorkshire, this footage shows a criminal leading police on the wrong side of the road and mounting pavements.
Go on. Go on, mate, get him.
While in Bridgewater in Somerset, a driver reaches a speed of 75 in a 30 miles per hour zone. After a car chase through residential streets, the police officer bravely uses his own car to force the driver off the road. The driver was caught and admitted charges of dangerous driving and driving with no insurance. He's given a 20-month suspended jail sentence and disqualified from driving for 2 years. In Cumbria, Inspector John Sherlock has years of experience in combating car crime. He's also an expert in using a stinger, a device which punctures the tyres of offending vehicles. One night he was called to stop a pair of joyriders.
It was a quiet shift. It was a Thursday evening. Hadn't been too busy that evening, so it was the early hours of the morning.
A stolen car was driving down this road, we're told, by officers at high speeds and erratically.
I think it was around 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and we received a call of a stolen car was in our area and was being pursued by other police vehicles and heading towards our town. The vehicle was heading in our direction. My job was to deploy the stinger device and burst the tyres. My last memory was seeing blue lights in the distance.
An officer tried to use a stinger device to stop it before it crashed into the car and hit the officer. That officer is now in intensive care in the West Cumberland Hospital in Whitehaven.
We get to the roundabout, nobody there at that time. John and his colleague Neil, they arrived, And we sort of set up site there. We knew that the Stinger was going to potentially be deployed. The vehicle was heading our way. John was Stinger trained.
What should have happened by the textbook is that I deploy the Stinger and it burst the tyres. But literally what happened was, as simultaneously as I was deploying the Stinger device, the vehicle veered into me, struck me somewhere between 40 and 50 miles an hour, and threw me a significant distance like a rag doll into a grass bank.
While the teenage joyriders were arrested immediately, John's colleagues were more concerned about him.
Very quickly, it was unconscious. It wasn't responding to us. And then there was discussion with the other officers that were there. What do we do with him? Do we move him? Do we not? He started then making this gurgling noise, which I'd heard before in my role as a police officer, that I knew he was struggling to breathe. So the decision was, we're going to have to move him, otherwise he's going to die.
My colleagues were superb. I was in trouble and they've saved my life.
It's very humbling, actually, because it's a team thing.
While Cumbria woke to the news of the night's dramatic events, in a nearby hospital, John was fighting for his life.
It was a couple of hours after we'd arrived at the hospital, we were allowed to go in. And it was terrible seeing him there, you know, because he was quite swollen. Obviously, he'd been sedated. He had tubes everywhere, bruises. It was horrible to see. You just don't ever think it's going to happen to you or your family. So it just didn't seem real.
John was in a medically induced coma for 7 days.
So I just used to sit there and talk to him and hope that he could hear me, and I'd tell him things like the football results and what had been going on. But it was just like a nightmare.
When John woke from the coma, Katie was by his bedside.
He opened his eyes and, you know, he looked at me and, you know, I told him that I loved him and he sort of nodded his head like, I know you do, and obviously he couldn't speak. And then within an hour of that happening, I think that's when the medical team realised that he wasn't moving his right side at all. So we had this great moment and then it was, oh, so there's a possibility that he's going to be paralysed down his whole right side.
John underwent 6 hours of surgery, and while his arm was saved, he would never regain full use of it again.
He did survive, but knows he'll never fully recover.
This incident may have changed the course of his life.
Today, he was talking about his ordeal for the first time.
I have no feeling in the arm whatsoever, apart from excruciating pain at times. It's like my hand is being crushed in a vice. I had to learn to speak again, I had to learn to eat again, I had to learn to stand up. It's like being a child again.
We'd only been together a year when his accident happened, and I was only 21 at the time as well, so it was a lot to take in, really. And a lot of people said, you know, you're very young and this is like a big deal and a lot to take on for someone your age, and if you wanted to walk away, you could. And I said I would never do that because I just love him too much.
Later, John is forced to make a courageous and life-changing decision.
I was probably a bit naive and didn't really realise the extent of what it would mean in the future.
In South Wales, Sergeant James Dowler has been with the police for 9 years. He's dealt with most crimes in his career, but he was totally unprepared for a vicious attack in the early hours of the morning in August 2015.
It was just before midnight. I was out by myself in a marked car and I was just conducting bail checks, which is a fairly mundane, run-of-the-mill task for a police officer to do, and it's just to double check that people that are on curfew are in their house when they should be. When I drove past the car and there was smoke coming from the car. So I turned around, just wanted to make sure that the occupants and everyone inside the vehicle was okay and check they hadn't broken down, that type of thing. I wasn't really thinking that anything was going to happen, so I pulled up and I opened my door. As I got out and the driver got out and started running away from me, everything changed in an instant. So I immediately chased after and eventually I caught up with him. And the next thing I know, we both ended up on the floor with me on top of the driver. It was at that point that I became aware behind me, all the car doors opening and all the other occupants coming out of the car. When they were walking towards me, when they were shouting and swearing for me to get off of the driver, that I realised that things weren't looking very good. Then I felt kicks and punches to my back. The female occupant of the car jumped on top of me. The next thing I felt was just excruciating pain. She was gouging my eye with her finger. I let out a massive scream and let go of the driver on the floor so that I could try and pull her finger out of my eye. The driver at that point, unfortunately, ran away. I was then left fighting with her on the floor. I clicked on the emergency activation button, which is on every police officer's radio, and it sends a live time result of where that officer is on a map so that the control room can say to other officers, there's someone that needs assistance, this is their location. And it was at that point I became aware that one of the other members of the crowd grabbed the radio off me and threw it away. And this was perhaps one of the scariest moments for me because I realised I was really on my own at this point. I was in a lot of trouble.
Fortunately, before his radio was snatched, his colleague Andrew heard his call for backup.
As soon as you hear that assistance shout, you drop down your tools and you just go as fast as you can to help. And I heard James shout, "The drive." That was the only information I heard him say, so that's why I headed straight there on the blue lights and sirens.
Meanwhile, James is still struggling with his attackers alone.
I managed to push the female from me, at which point she ran away from me. Eventually I did catch up with her some distance away, and this other occupant of the car stepped in and pushed her away from me. So it was just me and him then in the middle of the road. All the time I'm looking over my shoulder, waiting for my colleagues to arrive, hoping that I'd shouted out the correct location.
There are two ways into the location where James is being attacked. Andrew takes a gamble and chooses one.
I was just thinking, oh, how much further until I can see him so we can help him. And I was obviously getting a bit frustrated with myself. I thought to myself, I wish I'd come in the other entrance, but I knew there was nothing I could have done differently. It was a toss of a coin, and unfortunately I chose the wrong entrance. And it was at this point, I think, where I've seen James then up the street at the roundabouts grappling with the guy on the road.
And I remember seeing the reflection of blue lights on a house window, and it was at that point I thought, here we go. As that police vehicle turned up, the male that I was grappling with in the street punched me to the point where I lost consciousness and I was on the floor.
It's almost like you're watching a bit of a horror movie with your colleague and friend having a scuffle or a scrap in the middle of a roundabout. We were lucky there was two of us in the van at the time, as the male has run off down that street there, and my colleague, she jumped out of the van to help James, who was lying on the road at the time. And myself, I've gone after the person responsible, really. By the time I was able to get out of the van and chase after him, he was hopping over a garden wall, and unfortunately I'd lost him at that point.
The gang escape and are on the loose. James has sustained serious injuries to his face.
I had a quite badly broken nose, which required an operation a week later to put it back in place. I've got permanent numbness to the left part of my face, sort of on my cheek and my nose, which will never regain full feeling. My eye was, thankfully, wasn't permanently injured. And after a few days, my sight came back to normal. In terms of the way I looked, I had a lot of swelling, a lot of bruising, and that took several months for that to completely subside.
Over the next few days, the offenders are tracked down and arrested.
In relation to the female, when she was arrested, I then took part in an identification procedure, and I was able to pick her out on an ID parade, as I was with the driver and with the person that punched me as well.
The driver was sentenced to 14 weeks in prison and ordered to pay £250 compensation after pleading guilty to battery. The other two attackers were sentenced to 2 years in prison after pleading guilty to assault occasioning actual bodily harm.
From my perspective, I was pleased that they were apprehended and they were brought to justice.
2 weeks later, James returned to frontline policing.
I was very fortunate that I was able to return to work, and it took me a few months, but eventually I was back working with the same team. I'm quite proud to say that I was able to return to that same role that I was doing.
Although happy to be back, for James, revisiting the scene of the crime was a priority.
I do remember the first time I came back here. I remember feeling, the heart beating and the stomach sinking slightly. But for me, that was really important to get that out of the way. For me personally, if I didn't come back, if I didn't do what I was doing exactly as I was beforehand, there'd be an element that they had won, and I didn't want to let them win.
But the offenders haven't won, because Sergeant Dowler is still fighting off criminals in his new role as a detective.
Since that time, I've actually moved to more office or investigatory roles. It's not a direct, conscious decision because of what happened, it's just because naturally I like to investigate. Unless she wants to discuss it any further. I'm doing a job that I love, and I didn't want to let these people spoil that for me and ruin that for me. So in actual fact, I'll overcome this.
He'd been trying to stop a speeding car.
It's emerged that the driver had a history of offending.
This incident may have changed the course of his life.
11 years ago, Chief Inspector John Sherlock was nearly killed when joyriders hit him at high speed.
It should have killed me. The impact, the speed it hit me at, how I was thrown, most people would have been killed by that, but I lived, so I had so much to live for.
Though the criminals were arrested at the scene, both offenders were teenagers. The 17-year-old driver was charged with grievous bodily harm, dangerous driving, driving while disqualified, driving without insurance, and aggravated vehicle taking. He was sentenced to 2 years in a youth detention centre. The 14-year-old passenger received a community rehabilitation order and was not given a custodial sentence.
The driver was a 17-year-old. The judge, his hands were tied. I remember in the sentencing how he was almost apologetic to me. Basically, for a 17-year-old who was classed as a youth who committed those offences, the maximum sentence a judge could give was 4 years. So not much for what they did to me, but I don't really think about them.
It's just hard to believe that someone so young can ruin someone's life, really, and take so much away from someone.
John was off work for nearly a year after the incident.
The chief constable at the time visited me in hospital, and I said, "Sir, I will be back at work within a year." And he laughed and probably patted me on the shoulder and said, yeah, okay. But I was, so I was back at work, I think, something like 361 days after my accident, so that was one of my goals.
5 years after the incident, John's arm was in pain and he had no movement in it.
Because it was such a high point on the spine, that's why I still suffer today quite significant nerve pain through it.
So John made a courageous decision. He opted to have this right arm amputated.
In the initial years, there was always the hope through the operation that I had and the physiotherapy that the feeling may come back and I may be able to use it again. But I think I'd accepted that was never going to happen. So even though it was there, it was kind of lost to me, really.
I was probably a bit naive and didn't really realise the extent of what it would mean in the future. The main thing that I always think about that was being taken away is that John and I can't have a proper hug anymore. You know, it's like half a hug. And the fact that he can't do that with his children.
But despite everything he's been through, John's not a man to let anything stand in his way. His career has gone from strength to strength, and he's currently acting Chief Inspector.
One of my bosses, Mr. Towler, said something very interesting to me. He said, you know, you left West Cumbria in an ambulance and you came back as a Chief Inspector. And that's stuck with me, because it's an achievement. He was in the right place yesterday. He's got the bad guy. Good lad.
He's now at the helm of the team of officers which tackle crimes like joyriding every day.
He was in for attempt theft of motor vehicle.
There's a lot of witness inquiries to do today. CCTV is a big troll to do today.
Good policing. Thank you.
It's commendable, really, what he's done and how far he's come. He deserves to be where he is now. He really, really does. I mean, he's my Chief Inspector now.
There's a certain sense of satisfaction. Obviously, I've had to put a lot in myself, but my wife, Katie, has been amazing. And without her, I wouldn't be sat here today. Whatever situation in your life, you'll never have each day perfect. There will be down days. There will be days when the pain is too tough. There will be days where you'll doubt yourself, but you've got to pick yourself up, because you've got to look at the other people. You just have to remember the good things in your life, focus on those, and talk to people. Talk about it. That's been a key for me. I locked a lot of things away, but I found by talking to the right people, and especially my wife, who's very understanding, she gives me great strength.
John can now revisit the scene of the crime without any feelings of bitterness and sadness.
It's strange because I shouldn't be smiling. I'm standing here and I'm grinning. I should be grimacing. I should be angry. I should be... That's been taken from me, but, you know, what happened that night should have killed me. It didn't, and I'm still here, and I'm talking to you now, and I'm still a serving police officer doing the job that I love to do. I've no reason to be angry or sad.